Hello, this essay is entitled Why Compromise Should Be Avoided Like the Plague. This, of course, is from my compendium of essays entitled Rants and Ruminations. Generally, people constantly tell us again and again that we need more compromise in our civic life, that Democrats and Republicans should compromise. I am here to remind you that in many cases, compromise makes things desperately worse. And I'm going to give you 5 examples from foreign policy, economic policy, psychology, medicine, and religious pedagogy, if that's the way you pronounce it, which illustrate that compromise is a much overvalued phenomenon. All right, first of all, starting in foreign policy. In the Vietnam era, Lyndon Johnson was faced with 2 different positions. Either escalate the war in Vietnam and bomb the place to bits, which we did, or get out. And what did he do? He compromised. And that made everything worse for everybody. So what he did was, instead of a dramatic escalation, and instead of withdrawing, he came up with the compromise of a very gradual escalation. And from 65 to 68, our troop levels were gradually increased from about 25,000 to about 500,000. And the gradual escalation was terrible because what that did, it killed plenty of people, but it gave the NVA and the Viet Cong time to get more troops and build up their resources and build up their military muscle to meet our escalation. And so more Americans died and more Vietnamese died, and America's standing in the world was deeply damaged. Actually, I think we should have gotten out of the war completely, and I think our position was completely appalling and wrong. But that's not the point of this essay. The point was his policy of compromise meant it would just go on and on and on. That's point 1. Secondly, I'll give you economic policy. Now, most people know, economists know, of course the press doesn't tell you this, that when the economy is very depressed, what we need was a big stimulus. And that stimulus is generally achieved with big federal deficits. Now, when Obama became president, what we needed was a big deficit. And the deficits were already growing because of the downturn meant that fewer people were paying taxes because they weren't earning money. But still, we needed a much, much bigger deficit. And this is what's known as Keynesian economic policy, and most responsible economists subscribe to it. Although, of course, nobody most people who argue in the political debate don't even mention this. In any event, Obama was faced with 2 choices. Either give us the huge deficit we need or don't. So he compromised. He enlarged the deficit but not by enough. So what he did was he forestalled a collapse into a depression, but he did not give us enough of a stimulus to get us out of the recession, and that enabled Donald Trump to win 8 years later. Because in the industrial Midwest, by 2016, things were still terribly forlorn. Okay, let's move on to another field. Let's move on to psychology, more specifically psychoanalysis. And yes, I know that Freudian psychoanalysis has been attacked by many people. But whether it's right or wrong is not my point here. My point is how compromise makes things worse. Now, classical psychoanalysis, as formulated by Freud, was something that was to last 4 to 5 times per week. It was very intensive. Now, what did we do? What were you supposed to do in your sessions? Not talk a lot of cheap, stupid psychobabble. You were supposed to illuminate the unconscious conflicts which supposedly animated neurotic symptomology. And toward this end, he engaged in dream interpretation and free associations. Whether he succeeded or not, a lot of people would argue that point. In any event, things were made a whole lot worse when that abortion, which are known as psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, came very much into vogue in the United States. Now, it came into vogue for economic reasons. Most people don't have the money or the time to see a psychoanalyst 4 or 5 times a week. So, in psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, you'd only go once or twice a week. And so there was no time to really understand what was wrong with the patient. I mean, there was no time for the patient to delve into his unconscious by studying his dreams, to dissect and uncover unconscious conflicts. So what really transpired in psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy was that the therapist would simply assume what your problem was and trying to tell you that your problem was what he assumed it was. And generally, from the end of World War II until the end of the 1960s, if you were a guy, in the majority of cases, basically what the doctor had to tell you was this: your mother was a domineering bitch, your father was a wimp, and you were seriously at risk of being a faggot. And don't, interpret this as homophobia on my part. I am gay. And by using the word faggot, I'm not being homophobic. I'm demonstrating the extent of homophobia. But the point is, again, this was a rotten compromise. The choices were: don't have psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, or go 5 days a week. So the compromise was go once or twice a week, and in psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, instead of having the rigorous dream interpretations and free associations, the doctor would just say, you see, this is what's wrong with you. Medicine. Antiretroviral therapy for HIV. AZT was really good at combating the AIDS virus, but there was a big problem. If you gave a person AZT, and only AZT, it would work great at first, but then it would become a failure. Because after maybe a year, or 2 years, or maybe less, the virus would become resistant to AZT and would return with all of its virulence and devastating ferocity. So we understood, finally, that we had to give a conjunction of antiretrovirals together. And please don't for an instant think that really some people are doing fine because they only take one drug for HIV. Medicines such as Genvoya and Stribol are actually combinations of drugs all put into one pill. I must tell you something here. I might be a little dishonest with this example because I don't know of too many people who are saying, well, AZT monotherapy is cheaper. They don't even give AZT much anymore. But let's say, the updated thing would be Varied or Tenor or something like that. No one's going to say Varied monotherapy is cheaper, so let's just give Varied. Most people know you have to give a combination of drugs. But again, the point is still stated. Compromise doesn't work. It makes things a bloody failure. Okay, I gotta amend that in a couple of ways. That section on antiretroviral medications for HIV. Number one, I talked about AZT. AZT was the first drug used for HIV. But basically what I said about monotherapy, that is using just one drug, applies not only to AZT, but to all of the HIV medications. And that is, if you take just one drug by itself, and you don't take a cocktail of several drugs, the virus eventually will develop resistance. And perhaps more importantly, in terms of this essay is concerned, what I really gotta modify is my assertion that I didn't think that any doctors were compromising and giving only one antiretroviral instead of a cocktail to save money. I said I didn't think any doctors were doing that, but I just remember I was reading this in 1999 or the year 2000, I'm not sure, but some states in the Deep South and in the Rocky Mountains were not covering protease inhibitors. They were only covering drugs in the class known as the NRTIs. And in those days, before 98, all you had were the protease inhibitors and the NRTIs. AZT was one of the NRTIs. So basically, some states were compromising by saying, well, instead of giving you the full regimen, we'll give you a shitty regimen. And that shitty regimen, I think, could expedite death, and probably did expedite death. All right, I'll return you back to where we were. And the next thing is religious education. Now, I received a Jewish education, a Hebrew education. I went 3 days a week to Hebrew school. One day was devoted to learning the Hebrew language. Another day was devoted to learning the history of the Jewish people. And another day was learning our complex and Byzantine customs and cemeteries and ceremonies. This was a compromise. There was no time, we felt, for a traditional, all-consuming Jewish education. But at the same time, our parents didn't want us to have no Jewish education. So they compromised. They taught us some stuff. And we did learn quite a bit of stuff. But you know what? They left out a lot. They never told us anything. We never discussed right and wrong that much. Well, we knew pork was wrong. We knew that driving your car on Saturday was wrong. But generally, we didn't talk about morals that much. We never ever talked about what comes after death. And, we didn't discuss heaven or hell. We didn't talk about the things people usually talk about when they talk about religion. So most of us, after the rite of bar mitzvah, simply flew away from the synagogue. Again, it was a dreary compromise. Now, I'm not saying one should never compromise, but just beware when people say compromise is what is always needed.